Good morning. I extend a very warm welcome to everyone joining us for today's Bussola Institute webinar, Support for Education in Conflict Zones, Focus on the War in Ukraine. The invasion of Ukraine is foremost in all our minds at the moment. The 24-hour news cycle has literally brought home to us the barbarity of the conflict, the courageousness of the resistance, and the vulnerability of Ukraine's civilian population. When President Zelensky addressed the Irish Parliament some weeks ago, I was startled by one particularly striking statistic he shared with his audience. He said that at that point, more than 927 schools and educational institutions in Ukraine had already been damaged or destroyed. Indeed, we are delighted, and we will get an update today. We are delighted and hugely honored to be joined for today's discussion by Dr. Oleksiy Shkuratov, Deputy Minister for European Integration at Ukraine's Ministry of Education and Science. Dr. Shkuratov, I extend a very special welcome to you and assure you that our hearts and minds are with you and the Ukrainian people during these horrendous days. The enormous upheaval created by the conflict has been described as one of the fastest large-scale displacements of children since World War II, and it is depriving young people of their fundamental right to access education. Other Bussola webinars have shone a spotlight on the crucial issue of support for education in conflict zones across the world. Particularly, previous webinars dealt with the Middle East. Last November, we brought together a panel of leading international experts to examine the impact of armed conflict on children and the hugely detrimental effect it has had on their personal, social, and educational development. Today's webinar will look at the background to the conflict in Ukraine, the prospects for peace, and the likely consequences for Ukraine's civilian population, particularly the children. Today, our hugely experienced panel will also examine the many challenges faced in protecting access to education during the conflict. And we will hear about some genuinely groundbreaking initiatives currently being taken to provide educational opportunities for those displaced as refugees. Before I introduce my first guest, I just want to emphasize that all of our distinguished panelists come to us today with wide experience and expertise. Each one of them has a very extensive curriculum vitae, so I'm only proposing to highlight one or two aspects of their many achievements before I introduce each one in turn. Unfortunately, for operational reasons, our good colleagues at UNICEF are unable to join us for today's webinar as originally envisaged. I know that our audience will appreciate how stretched teams are on the ground at the moment due to the precarious situation in Ukraine. I wish them well and look forward to engaging their expertise in a future Bussola webinar. To begin with, I'm delighted to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Donnacha O'Bacháin, Professor at the School of Law and Government in Dublin City University. Donnacha lectures on post-Soviet politics and foreign policy at DCU. He was awarded a Marie Curie Fellowship by the European Commission to conduct research on the color revolutions in the former Soviet republics, including the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. He is also a regular and very highly respected media commentator on the war in Ukraine. Donnacha, to begin with, can you start maybe by briefly explaining how we got here, how war has returned to Europe, despite the earnest declarations that this would never happen again, and the apparent success of the European project? Over to you, Donnacha.
Thank you, John, and thanks for inviting me to this event. I've been visiting Ukraine now for more than than 20 years, and have been to really all parts of it, from Lviv to Donetsk, from Kiev to Yalta. And I think, like many people, the war came as a completely unexpected shock, and it has been emotionally exhausting to watch the brutal horrors that are being visited upon the Ukrainian people. Only 3 days before the war, I had friends from Kiev visit me here in Dublin, and they returned to Kiev because for them they weren't expecting that there would be an invasion, and that just gives you some idea of how, life was normal in Ukraine, and people were living normal lives, and this was unexpected. And now, 2 months later, we have 13 million people who've been displaced from their homes, 5 million refugees, and almost 8 million internally displaced people. And many of them, as you've mentioned, are students and faculty and people involved in the education center. I myself saw Kharkiv University being destroyed online. It's a university that I gave lectures in the past. I gave lectures in Donetsk University over a decade ago, and the poor faculty and students of that university had to relocate in 2014 because of the Russian imposed conflict in Donbass, and they relocated to where? To Mariupol, which of course is now they're being re-traumatized again, and one can't imagine really the tragedies that are being visited daily in that blighted city. So to answer your question directly about, how did we get to where we are? In a word, Russia. And if I was to add two more words, I'd say Vladimir Putin. I mean, this is Putin's war, and it is Russia's war. The two go together. I mean, he's enjoyed a surge of popularity within Russia as a result of this war. So it's not just one man solitarily pursuing an objective. This is a collective effort, and that's why Ukraine is struggling for its survival. So maybe I'll just simply say what this war is not about, because the Kremlin has its own narrative about what this war is about. It's not about liberating Ukraine. Ukraine is a sovereign democracy. This is about occupation. It's about subordination. It's not about protecting Russians in Ukraine. We are now witnessing the mass murder of Ukrainians by the Kremlin. It's not about protecting Russian speakers in Ukraine, the vast majority of whom are hostile to Kremlin intervention. It's not about denazification, which was again one of the official narratives. I mean, as we all know, President Zelensky is a Jew. And indeed, in the 450-seat parliament of Ukraine, not a single member of a far-right party was elected on the party list system. It's not about Ukraine being neutral or demilitarized or not a member of NATO. For many years, Ukraine has not been a member of NATO. For many years, it has been neutral. It didn't stop Russia invading in 2014 and annexing Crimea, for example. It's not about Ukraine moving into NATO and NATO moving eastwards. This is about countries in Central and Eastern Europe moving westwards. And these are sovereign democratic governments making a choice. And this is not about Ukraine being a threat to Russia, which is something you often hear, and it was repeated yesterday in Moscow. It's about Russia being a threat to Ukraine. So this is about an attempted destruction of a country and a people, because Vladimir Putin has made it clear that he doesn't believe that there's a separate Ukrainian people. He portrays them as some kind of political Frankenstein stitched together in Soviet times and now sustained artificially by his adversaries. This is about empire building. It's about making Russia great again. It's about regime change. It's about replacing a democratically elected government with a pliant puppet. It's about dictatorship versus democracy. And this is why this is not just Ukraine's war. This is our struggle too. This is something which we've seen in Europe before. Totalitarianism trying to impose itself on smaller neighbors, on democracies. And this is the latest chapter in a long story. The Kremlin, as we know, quashed the Hungarians in 1956 when they tried to move to a freer way of living. They tried to suppress the Czechs and the Slovaks in 1968, the Poles throughout the 1980s. All these nations are now in the European Union and in NATO. 14 of NATO members have joined since the end of the Cold War. 16 of the 27 EU members have joined since the end of the Cold War. And for many of those countries, it's about exercising a choice to escape the abusive cycle of history imposed upon them by the Kremlin. And this is Ukraine's choice as well. And this is why this murderous war has been imposed upon the Ukrainian people. And it's why we must try to do as much as we can to help the people of Ukraine in their hour of need. And I know that's on the minds of most Irish people right now.
Thank you very much, Donncha, and I will come back to you again. I'm going to ask everybody, I should have said this at the beginning, one question at the beginning, and then we'll come back. Now, my second panelist I've already mentioned, and as I said in my opening remarks, we are delighted and hugely honored to be joined for today's discussion by Dr. Oleksiy Shkuratov, Deputy Minister for European Integration at the Ukraine's Ministry of Education and Science. Dr. Shkuratov holds a PhD in economics and is a former vice rector for research and innovative development in Kyiv, National University of Construction and Architecture. And to begin with, Minister, you have our deepest admiration as you and your colleagues continue to manage Ukraine's education system in the midst of this terrible conflict. Can you please share with us here today some of your thoughts on the position of your students and teachers and how you're delivering education services in these almost impossible circumstances?
Thank you, Mr. John. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear friends. Now you are following severe developments in Ukraine, and thank you for your support. I would like to start my intervention with a quote from Nelson Mandela, which, by the way, is written on the wall of premises of the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine. Education is most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. So it is crucial for us to keep this weapon and not to lose it. As of yesterday, 1,500 educational institutions have been damaged from bombing and shelling. More than 100 are completely destroyed. We still do not know how many of our students and educators has lost our education because of Russian aggression. It is an honor for me to be here and to speak about Ukrainian education under aggression. At the end of February, when the war began, all the education system of Ukraine went on unscheduled vacations. However, starting from mid-March, the educational process began to resume gradually. As of today, more than 3.5 million of school students from 4 million has resumed their studies. The majority of vocational and higher education institutions are operating. Preschool institutions resume their work. At the moment, educational process takes place in remote and blended mode, as security for students and teachers is our key priority. Is many students and teachers have left their homes. We try to involve them to teaching and learning at places of their temporary residence. Pupils and students can study both in educational institutions in regions of Ukraine with better security situation of continuing learning online at their usual educational institution if possible. We also involve temporarily displaced educators to teaching. Besides, Ukraine continues to pay salaries to teachers regardless if they continue teaching or not, if they are displaced or stay in the most affected cities and regions. We widely use information technology for learning. The All Ukrainian Education Online platform is currently functioning. It proposes tools to study for teachers and students of grades 5 to 11. We have launched the All Ukrainian online schedule for all students, including primary school, on the basis of interactive Google Schedule. Vocational education and higher education institutions also have experience and infrastructure to provide distance learning, but for vocational and technical education sector, it is less effective tool because of significant practical component in the educational programs. The important problem is lack of digital device, in part because a lot of students and teachers were forced to leave their homes without belongings and documents. To solve this issue, we are actively working with our partners. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. And it's wonderful to hear what you're actually achieving in spite of the appalling circumstances in which you find yourselves. And as you know, and as the whole world knows, we learned a lot from COVID in relation to online learning and in relation to the use of technology. And it's wonderful to see again that you're using this. And of course, the lack of digital devices is a big issue and is always a big issue in areas of conflict. But we'll come back to you again, as with the others, and we'll take up some of those issues. And I'd like to move on at this stage to Mona Hines. And Mona is principal of Mary Immaculate Secondary School in Listún Varna, which is a small rural town on Ireland's west coast. And I know that when the opportunity arose to directly respond to the Ukrainian crisis, Mona's inspirational leadership as principal meant that she took action and immediately enrolled a large number of Ukrainian second-level students and another larger number of further education learners into her school. She's also working with a number of Ukrainian teachers to develop innovative and inclusive teaching and learning opportunities, both for the students and for the teachers. And Mona will fill us in on what she's achieving. And Minister, it's but one example of what's happening now in so many schools around Ireland, across Europe, and indeed in other parts of the world. So my first question to Mona really would be, at the outset, maybe you could share with us the circumstances that led you to welcoming these displaced Ukrainian students into your school community, and the challenges that you face as well as a school in providing continuity of learning and education for them.
Thank you, John. It is a privilege and an honor to be here with everyone today. As a principal of a small rural school teetering on the edge of the Burn in North Clare, we would have a school population of about 260 students and a town population, I'd say, of almost 1,000. So in early March, I suppose the context, of our small town as well, if I could just bring you through that. We are a seasonal tourist little town in North Clare, and there are a number of hotels which really are active during seasonal time, summer months and September. The rest of the months, they're idle. Also in 2017, one of those hotels became a direct provision centre. So the impact on our school as well, happened there, in that an awful lot of asylum seekers became integrated in our school through the adult education system. And from that, we learned quite a bit in our school about integration on a wider scale within the community, and how important our school was in ensuring that asylum seekers to our small town felt welcome and could progress and could have an opportunity to gain a better quality of life in our area. Our school is a Mercy school. We are in the Kesht patronage, and that really is significant as well, in that the Mercy Sisters would have visited Lisdoonvarna in 1940 and observed that there was no second level school there for the children in the area. They would have gone to a neighbouring town in Innistymen, or else in Kinvara. So they had the vision there to set up their school in 1949 for all girls initially. And then in 1955, they began to enroll the boys, because again, it's responding to the need within the community and creating an inclusive education system. So we were one of the first co-educational voluntary secondary schools in Ireland at the time in 1955. And all of this develops a tradition and a context to how our mission statement is really important to us, in that we provide education for all members of our community. So in early March, when we did hear rumours that these hotels would be welcoming Ukrainian people, we tried to prepare as best we could for what we thought might be 20 teenagers coming to join our school. So in mid-March, they arrived, and I met the parents and met the students. I visited the hotels during St. Patrick's Day weekend, and I quickly realized that they were far more than 20, nearing 60 students that would need to be enrolled in our school. Without hesitation, we had an open evening March, and we welcomed the family. Really important school to meet with them and to have that human face connection with these Ukrainian people. And we helped with the enrollment process. And obviously 60 students is quite a number to take in. So what I created with my team of teachers were two classrooms, a junior and a senior classroom for our Ukrainian students. And in the beginning weeks, then we assessed their level of English, number one. We interviewed each of them and their hopes and ambitions, and we kind of got to know them and created that human connection with them. It was very important, I felt, to lead and to offer a place for these students, these young teenagers, to have structure to their day, to come every day, to learn about our system. So the first number of weeks was really learning on all sides for us. We had screening tests with English, and then we realized that quite a number of them had excellent English and very, very academic, very self-motivated, very strong in maths and DCG, engineering and physics and science. And they really were inspirational to meet. And they immediately made such a strong impression on our staff. And gradually they have been integrated, over half of them have been integrated into our mainstream classes. Now, the challenges in a small school really is to obviously find the space to work on what these students actually need to build on their strengths. And that really is a learning process, an evolving process all the time. So currently what we have, as I said, is over half of them integrated into our mainstream. And then the others we're working on EAL, and Paulina, who you'll hear later, our Ukrainian teachers are absolutely vital in the working and the success of this integration process. And Paulina works in the EAL and developing the English skills for the students in our Ukrainian class. The challenges, yes.
Sorry, I'll come back to you actually on those.
Great.
Because there's a range of challenges. So we'll deal with the positive first, and then
the positive. Yes, yes.
And you mentioned Paulina there. So thanks a million, Mona. I'll come back to you shortly on that. Paulina, I'm especially pleased now to introduce Paulina Shevchenko. And Paulina, you're hugely welcome to Ireland. And I know you've had the traumatic experience of leaving your own country. And now, as you told me before we started, you're settling in very well to the west of Ireland. So supporting indeed your fellow Ukrainians here in our country. Paulina has a master's degree in English literature and is also a fully qualified interpreter. She attended the Department of Psychology of Odessa Pedagogical University and is now a hugely valued member of the staff of Mona's school. So maybe, Paulina, Mona has already told us about the circumstances that led to this large number of Ukrainian students coming to Lisbon Varna. Can you just tell us briefly how you came to join the team at Mary Immaculate as when you had to leave from Odessa? Your mic is off. Paulina, your microphone is switched off there. Paulina, sorry, we can't hear you. Now.
Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank you for having me here. It is an honor to be a part of this webinar. I would like to express my gratitude to Irish people, to Irish government, how welcoming they are, how helpful, how open they are. And that was an amazing experience. We made great connections. And this support it's hard to overestimate. So from the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you very much for accepting us into your community. So talking about the situation that I had in Ukraine. For the last 5 years, I've been working as an interpreter and was teaching kids privately, teaching grown-ups and kids of a different age. When the war started, I was in Lviv. As we had a bad COVID situation in Odessa and the education was online, I decided to take advantage and take my kids and bring them to the excursion. We never visited Lviv. And in 2 days, we were absolutely overwhelmed and shocked with the news that the war started. We woke up in the morning and heard terrible news about it. So it took me a while to take a decision, and I knew that being a mom, my first priority is my kids and protection of my kids. So I took this heavy decision to leave my country. So I've stayed around 2 weeks in Poland. So when the first shock passed, I started to think, what can I do in this situation? Where can I be productive? What can I contribute? Where is my front? And these are questions that every human in this situation would ask, because it's very important to have this feeling of belonging somewhere and the feeling of being useful. You left your country, you knew that a part of your family is still there, your friends are still there, some friends are fighting. So what can you do? How can you be productive in this situation and be helpful? So it took me a while to understand that I need to go to English-speaking country, because I knew that English this is my tool, and this is what I can do, and this is where I can contribute. So on the way from Dublin airport to Lisbon Varna, being on that bus ride, I had a clear idea in my head that I would like to join a local school and be as much helpful as it was possible. So when we arrived to the hotel, 2 days later, we were suggested to fulfill an application that would contain an information about our profession, occupations, and in that application, I mentioned that it would be honor for me to participate in a local school. So this is how I got an offer to join the team. And we started to work. My first task was to be an interpreter and to help our kids to adjust to new reality. And as you understand, everything was new, and it's very hard on kids, so many changes in the role. And it was overwhelming for teachers as well, to our Irish colleagues. Language barrier, not knowing the system of Ukrainian education, how everything works, and to identify the level of knowledge of our kids. It was a process, and we are still in the process. So my journey here began as an interpreter, and then later I started to give my own lessons to our Ukrainian kids, to enforce their knowledge and to encourage them to learn English on a daily basis.
That's great. Thank you so much. And we'll come back to you again. But I just want to say this: we are very lucky that you're here with us, and you're most welcome. Donncha, I'll come back to you at this stage. We've been talking about the war, how it came about, the carnage, what's going on, what's happening, and the suffering that the civilian population is continuing to pay this very high price. And at this point, in your view, are there any indications as to how long this conflict is likely to go on for? I know it's simply guessing, but based on your experience, your knowledge of the region, your knowledge of Russia, what would your view on that be?
Well, this conflict has, I guess, against expectations, become a protracted conflict. I mean, yes. Vladimir Putin was planning on a blitzkrieg. He believed that the asymmetry of power between Russia and Ukraine would lead to a swift defeat in Ukraine for the Ukrainians, but he underestimated Ukrainians, as we know, and they initiated a heroic resistance to this kind of multi-vector attack. So much so that the Russians were forced to retreat from around Kiev, and have now had to refocus their efforts on the Donbass region after losing 7 generals, and estimates vary, but between 15 and 20,000 troops. And therefore, as I said, it's become a different type of conflict, a protracted conflict. What we do know is that this war will continue until it's in Vladimir Putin's interest for it not to continue. And that can only be as a result of 2 outcomes. Either Vladimir Putin wins in this conflict, and then he seeks to get some kind of a settlement to retroactively endorse his territorial acquisitions and to subordinate Ukraine, or Russia is itself defeated in Ukraine. They're the only 2 options. And because there is no I guess, military superiority or obvious military superiority right now, it's open-ended. There's an increasing acknowledgement that if Ukraine is helped to help itself, to defend itself, it can repel Russian aggression. It's shown that in the way that it repelled the attempt to capture Kiev. So unfortunately, what was, as I said initially, a very, what was seen to be a very brief conflict has now become a protracted one, and it's going to be a different type of conflict in different areas. It will be regular warfare in some areas, like in Donbass. It will be irregular warfare in those areas where Russia is already occupying parts of Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Danica. And we'll develop that a little further if we have sufficient time. And just maybe, Minister, to return to you again at this stage, you have heard from Mona and Paulina how the children who came from Ukraine to their particular part of Ireland have been integrated into their school. And you will be aware, you're aware more than any of the rest of us are, of the many displaced Ukrainian children and teachers currently who are being welcomed and integrated into schools across Europe and elsewhere. And even where the children have been made refugees by this desperate war of aggression against your country, all of us, your neighbours, want to ensure that their education can still continue. Is there more that other countries can do to help these Ukrainian young people displaced by conflict?
Thank you. We are thankful to our friends from other countries who host our students and teachers. It's really reliable support to our education system, ensuring continuity and sustainability of learning in wartime. Ukraine takes maximum efforts in order Ukrainian children don't break the connection with Ukrainian education. Many partners countries integrate children from Ukraine to their education systems, and we are grateful for these efforts. We have launched a broad advocacy campaign for Ukrainian education worldwide, especially school education, to support organization of learning for Ukrainian children abroad. All our instruments of distance learning are available from any place at the world. We have developed guidelines for their use. We communicate with our colleagues from other countries and our diplomatic missions all the time. PDF versions of Ukrainian schools textbooks are available free for downloading and use. So yes, we need more help and support. Provide our children with access to digital device and broadband internet to study using Ukrainian e-learning resources. Involve teachers from Ukraine and coordinators to this process. Establish classes and groups for training Ukrainian children. Support our initiative of establish Ukrainian education hubs in your countries. Example centers for teaching children from Ukraine. I assure you that no Ukrainian student will be excluded from Ukrainian education system. We do all our best that in this difficult time learning is a passive and stabilizing factor, not an educational source of stress.
Thank you very much indeed. And that is hugely important. And I'll come back to you about this whole issue of stress and pressure again, if we hope we'll have enough time. But just maybe Mona to take up the importance of what Minister was saying there. I mean, I know that for all Ukraine or most Ukrainian people here in Ireland and elsewhere, their hope, their dream is to get back home again as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
So that it's hugely important that we try to continue their Ukrainian education, continue them in that system, while also maybe teaching them or showing them some of our system as well and blending the two together. And that is probably one of the big challenges that you were about to talk about earlier on. How is that working out for you?
It is a challenge, and that connection with their Ukrainian education is extremely important. And a lot of our students are still online in the Ukraine, studying in their native school, and we would provide a digital device for those students while they're in their school or in our school, or they could take the loan of that device for the hotel in the evening. A lot of their tutorials are pre-recorded. Some of our older senior students are still on their high school or college education is still continuing in the Ukraine, so as to ensure that they have their digital device with them. Now, students themselves are still, they are very interested in learning about the Irish system. And we had a number of workshops with our senior students on guidance and all the different avenues into college and into university here in Ireland. And they are extremely interested in that. Our school is a second level school, but we also have an adult ed section to it as well, where we look at level 4, level 5, level 6 BTEI, and also PLC. And some of our senior students are very interested in the PLC route as well for next year. So it's to show them all the various options, and obviously allow them the space as well where they can still keep up with their Ukrainian education. Our Ukrainian teachers are vital, and teachers of the Ukrainian language as well are really important, and that familiarity and that connection that we're all very open and very anxious to ensure that that connection is not broken. So it's allowing them the space, allowing them the resources to keep that balance.
Great, great. And Paulina, from your perspective, did you see a great difficulty for the students in trying to transition from one education system to another and still keep in close contact with their own system, that again, hopefully they'll be re-entering in the months or whatever ahead?
Well, definitely, we faced with different challenges during the transitional period.
Yes.
And transitional period itself cannot be easy, right? So you face with something new, you face with the fear of unknown, you don't know what to expect. And after talking with students, I identify two biggest fears that they had. The first one was not to be accepted, not to be understood, to be judged, not to be a part of the group. And teenagers, you know how important it is for them to be accepted in the group. So that was fear number one. Fear number two and challenge number two, English language barrier. They were so afraid that they will not understand anything, that they will not understand anyone, and the level of anxiety was very high. So at the end of every lesson, when the lesson was over, students came and they will continue asking questions. They were wondering about each detail. They wanted to know everything about new system, about the plan for future, while even we teachers, we didn't have particular answers at that time because we still were in the process. And as the final point of the transition, or the final purpose, is to bring Ukrainian kids into mainstream classes.
Yes.
Language was number one, a key to its process. So kids were tested and we saw the real picture, their level of English. So we could understand that the majority can join mainstream class, while other kids, they need some encouragement, enforcement, and a little bit of work at their English level. the challenges that I personally faced, and I've never thought about such things as Ukrainian and Russian languages. It was so interesting that some kids, they are very fluent in Russian and in Ukrainian, so they accept academical information in both languages. But some students, they are from areas where they speak only Ukrainian and where they taught only in Ukrainian language. So for them to accept the information, for instance, in Russian language, when I was explaining them English, was difficult, and vice versa. For those students who are from Russian-speaking regions, for them it was a little bit more difficult to understand in Ukrainian. So what we did, we were explaining information in Ukrainian, then in Russian, and then in English. So it was an interesting moment. Then, as Ms. Hines mentioned, kids were subdivided into two groups, junior and senior, but still I faced with a diversity of age. So one class could contain kids on their 6th year of education, and some kids were on their 9th year. So it created a certain challenge. So the task was to compose the lesson in a way it would be interesting for all of them. Because some of them, they were advanced in their knowledge, and some were just only beginners. And of course, it's also important, like educational facilities, books. So we are working on it right now, and we are expecting books, and we will use it together with our students and force them in their English.
Great. Thank you so much, Paulina. That is hugely interesting and very helpful, because you're going through this process yourself and you understand more clearly than we would even. And to return, Donncha, to you, and we'll build on this, not alone are there students coming here to schools, but there are also students who want to come here and continue their university education. And as you're aware, the Irish universities are currently establishing, or have established, a one-stop information hub for Ukrainian students who wish to continue their university education. Would you like just maybe to comment on that from the perspective of Dublin City University?
Absolutely, John. It's a great initiative. It makes sense to coordinate at a central level, to centralize, so that we're not all reinventing the wheel. This is being led by the Irish Universities Association in conjunction with the Department for Higher Education. So while you do have this kind of centralized and coordinated approach, you also do have room for autonomous initiative at the university level, and I know that at DCU, for example, there's been a lot of initiatives that have come from both staff and students. I was speaking only yesterday to our president, Dara Kyo, and he informed me that Ukrainian students at DCU are being treated as Erasmus students automatically. So it means that there's no new initiative needed, that they're simply streamlined and it conforms with what we already have. It also means that they can gain credits then at DCU, which they can retain when they return to their home institutions. And then even on the level of accommodation, DCU has offered the government 400 beds, which is normally student accommodation, to kind of temporarily relieve the anticipated pressures on accommodation at a national level, not least in Dublin. And there's been a dedicated web page. There's a dedicated task force within DCU that is monitoring our response to the Ukrainian situation. So there's a lot that has been done. There's a lot that is being done. It will obviously vary depending on where students are coming from, because of course some students might be coming from regions of Ukraine which have a realistic expectation of return soon after the war subsides. Others, for example, if you're coming from somewhere like Mariupol, where virtually every building has been destroyed or damaged, even when the war subsides, there isn't a home to go to, and therefore a longer stay is anticipated. So, but there is a holistic approach, and I have to say it's been very heartwarming to see the very instinctive response from faculty and students. I've attended lots of meetings at DCU that have been organized by faculty and students, and the level of enthusiasm to do something and to help is overwhelming, and it's something that I think the department and the university have been good at harnessing.
Great, thank you very much, Donncha. And Minister, I'll return to you to give you a kind of almost a final, session here. Maybe you and Mona. You mentioned stress and pressure that's on Ukrainian students who come here, and indeed the Ukrainian refugees generally. And I know that you and your government must have serious concerns regarding the long-term implications for Ukraine, where your country, may face a post-conflict challenge of an entire generation of children having had their education disrupted. And combining that with the fact that it is well known that in conflict zones, the impact of trauma and adversity on young people is extensive. May I ask for your views on this, please, Minister?
I don't think education is lost for this generation of children. We don't interrupt the educational process.
Sure.
All countries, all educational system have affected COVID-19 pandemic. So to speak about the current generation of Ukrainian children as lost for education is biased and wrong. Indeed, we should evaluate not only infrastructural and human losses, but also educational. I am convinced that all civilized world makes every effort to restore Ukrainian education as soon as possible. Regarding the mental health situation is difficult. I suppose this problem will exist among us for a long time. Their war has affected and unfortunately will influence on the psycho-emotional state of education seekers at all levels, from preschool to university students. Forced suspension of the educational process, constant threat to life and security due to aggressive rocket and bomb strikes have a negative impact on the health of our children. In this regard, it is important to provide appropriate psychological support and responses to existing threats and prevention of future post-traumatic syndromes. We are working on this and involving all available forces, but they are not enough given the scale of the problem. In this regard, we ask you, dear colleagues, to join the action to provide the necessary assistance to our children and the younger generation. We would be very grateful for efficient initiatives and facilitation in solving this actual problem.
Thank you very much indeed. Mona, I have to ask you to answer this in about 2 minutes because we do end on the hour. So just given what the minister has just said, and this is an enormous issue, and given the trauma that the Ukrainian children and their parents have suffered, just again in less than 2 minutes, how did you involve the wider school community in addressing their emotional and psychological needs? Or how will you do so in the future?
I suppose I can, initially I felt that welcoming them into the school and giving them a structure to their day, ensuring that their resources were gathered for them, and that was a call out to our wider community for donations of uniform, which was our own students before the Ukrainians arrived, felt that the uniform was really important, that our Ukrainian students wore our uniform so that they were visible and they were the same as everybody else, and you know, that was really important for them to feel that they belonged. So I suppose the basic need that our school can provide is a space, a safe space, teachers that are there to be kind and supportive. It crosses all barriers. And my own son, who's 16, he came across some, Ukrainian students in his year group. Their English is improving, but he said, "Ma'am, it doesn't matter. We are the same as them." Like that, they have a common communication and that integration with their peers, be it on the furthest corner from them in Europe. They are alike. He says we are the same. So I think providing that space for them, and yes, there is trauma, no doubt, and that will emerge. But I feel that the healing of the welcome and the continuation of education will go a long way to alleviating just the extent of that.
Thank you very much, Mona, and thanks to all of you. And I want to express my most sincere thanks to each one of you today for sharing your expertise and your considerable experience in this most important Bussola webinar. And as I said at the outset, the invasion of Ukraine is foremost in all our minds at the moment. And as we've seen from the contributions here today, it's the extent to which it ultimately impacts all of us. We're especially grateful to you, Dr. Shkuratov, for joining us today and for being with us and for your invaluable insights, given the enormous pressures that you and your government colleagues are currently shouldering. And arising from today's webinar, we will in Bussola follow up with experts in conflict zones in the Middle East to explore the shared challenges involved and the potential for developing common strategies to support learning in conflict situations across the globe. And we will put a report together on that. However, we've also heard today inspiring stories of empathy, support, and real innovation that are helping to counter the enormous upheaval created by the conflict in Ukraine, and a determination, all of us determined to do whatever it takes to restore to its children and young people their fundamental rights of access to education. So I wish we could go on for another hour, but we can't. And again, thank you all from my heart. Thank you all most sincerely. We'll be keeping an eye on this issue, and we may even have a further webinar discussion on this in the near future. Thank you all very, very much.